So according to Capitol Hill sources, Pramila Jayapal, who is the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, is going to try to force a vote this afternoon on Biden's policy toward Afghanistan, which I've described on this show as genocidal, as potentially genocidal, in which he is doing a number of things that the UN is saying are putting more than 20 million people's lives at risk. And according to people that I've spoken to in Afghanistan now, people are already dying, already freezing to death and already starving to death because of these policies. And so what Jayapal is going to try to do is have some way for the House to weigh in on this, which will put people on one side of this question or the other. I've had a lot of people who, whenever I talk about this, say, look, it's the Taliban's problem, not our problem. And I understand that. Like that's an America First impulse that is not unique to the right. But what people don't understand is the basic facts of what we're doing here. It's not that we are, through some type of benign neglect, just allowing an unfortunate tragedy to unfold. What happened is that when the Taliban took over, we seized all of the central bank deposits that were controlled or they're supposed to be controlled by the Afghanistan government. It's about $9 billion in assets that had come to them basically through exporting products. Importing and exporting, the central bank collects the money, the central bank then distributes it back out to the banks. It was being held in the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and then we would send it in by $150 million, $300 million a week, and that's what would keep the currency stable and keep the banking system liquid. We just grabbed that money and said, done. Central bank's not getting any more of this. IMF and World Bank were responsible for an enormous amount of development projects in the country. We put the squeeze on them, said no, nothing else. Don't give any more else to these projects. People say, well, don't give money to the Taliban. We spent 20 years building an independent central bank in Afghanistan, modeled on the Federal Reserve, that has Western board members on it. I talked to one guy, he's an economist at Montgomery College. He's still on the board. He meets quarterly. The Taliban get a briefing quarterly on what the central bank is up to, but they have left the law in place that leaves it completely independent. Because that's not what the Taliban wants to do. The Taliban's got its own social issues. That's the thing that drives them. They're fine to leave in place a central bank that has become, the envy of that region of the world. People are like, wow, this actually works in keeping the currency stable and keeping the banking system liquid. And so that banker, for instance, is still on the board. And so if we wanted to, if we're nervous that the Taliban is going to run away with the money and do terror with the money, we can monitor it the entire way. We can watch it move electronically from the New York Federal Reserve Bank to the Afghanistan Central Bank, and then watch it distributed out to the banks electronically around the country. And most importantly, it becomes capital lending for importers, people who are importing products into Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a heavily import-driven country. And you need the balance of payments to work out so that the importers can give the money to Pakistan, to Iran, to Russia, to China, to the United States, wherever they're importing goods from. They need capital to get those things going. Otherwise, everything seizes up. And so because we have seized all the money, people that have money in banks can't get their money out. People who, teachers, government workers, et cetera, can't get their paychecks. Nobody has any money. So people are now burning their furniture to stay warm. They're selling their furniture for the next day's food. All the while, the U.S. is insisting that the Taliban, let women and girls go to work and to school, which they're mostly allowing, and that they form an inclusive government, which means kind of their former enemies be allowed into the government. So they're doing the first thing. But if all of the jobs are gone and nobody can get paid and the schools are shuttered because everything is shut down, then gender equity doesn't mean anything, because women and girls are dying.
If they starve to death, it doesn't mean anything.
Starve to death. And we were never interested in an inclusive government that included the Taliban. So it's an unusual demand, and there's no suggestion that us starving people is going to then get them to
Never seems to work.
Name some Harvard stooge as their Minister of Interior or whatever.
Right, and it's not going to make the people rise up against the Taliban.
Right.
That's not going to happen. It's just going to make them
they don't have
angry
anything,
at us.
Right.
They don't have any. They're not going to rise up. It's the Taliban's country. They're going to be in charge. We had a good 20-year run where we tried
we had our shot.
Something else. It collapsed overnight. We set up a house of cards. It didn't. No amount of money could make it work. No amount of effort could make it work. It's done. We lost. It's over. It did not work. It would be horrifically cruel to cause so many people to die because of our wounded pride, our just deal with these people, deal with the Taliban, and get the money, and it's not like
and it's
not let the people die,
and it's not our money. And what's ironic is that instead of giving them their money, what Biden has done is he's offered more than $300 million in aid. That is tax money.
Yeah.
That is U.S. money.
No, don't do that.
That is
give them their money.
And it's not going to help anyway. It goes through the UN. The UN gobbles most of it up for their administrative costs.
Right.
And then the UN, sprinkles a little bit of it out. And it may sound strange for somebody on the left to be saying just let the market work. But if you just get the economy going, that is so much better for the Afghan people than just giving them a few $100 million through the UN.
There are people in our government who don't want that. They don't want Afghanistan to succeed because it's now run by the Taliban. So they want it to be a failed state. They don't want the Taliban to get any credit for turning things around. No. But that's going to involve a lot of death.
Yeah, and there's a debate in historical circles over whether the Great Hunger, the potato famine, is properly a genocide. Because
the Irish potato famine.
Right, the Irish potato famine. The English policy fed, I guess fed isn't the right word, drove that famine and killed millions of people and drove millions more to flee. And so there are plenty of people, and I guarantee you, whether he would admit it or not, Joe Biden is one of those people who believes that was a genocide directed by
the British
Parliament, by the British toward the Irish.
It was somewhat bad circumstances, though, as well, too, wasn't it?
Yes,
crop failures were.
Those crops failed all over Europe, though. Mm-hmm. Only in Ireland did millions of people starve, and there was policy from Britain that said that the Irish were lazy, and that it was the heyday of this kind of laissez-faire liberalism that said, there are a bunch of drunks and lazy Catholics, and we need to get them working, and the way to get them working is don't give them handouts because then they're just going to be lazier. And so that was the kind of viciousness that was coming out of London at the time. And there were plenty of others who were actually fine if it went the way that it actually did go. The Irish population just, I think last year, rebounded to what it was pre-1850. That's how devastating that genocide was, which I'm fine to call it a genocide. And I think it is deeply ironic that as president, Biden is potentially going to oversee a very similar policy in Afghanistan, which is with very similar consequences, and it will also produce a migrant crisis.
We call the Soviet policies what they resulted on Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
A genocide of sorts. China's the Mao era. We call that a genocide. The Great Leap Forward.
And so. What's also interesting, the Holodomor in Ukraine produced a migrant crisis of Ukrainians fleeing west. The Nazis capitalized on that heavily. So in the 1930s, a lot fueled their rise, hyperinflation, the Versailles Treaty out of World War I.
Racism, despite what Whoopi thinks.
Racism, and racism against Ukrainians and Slavs and others to the east that they also considered inferior. But migrants from Ukraine coming into Germany because of that genocide that Stalin was carrying out fueled the rise of fascism. It is a regular phenomenon around the world that these migration crises fuel the far right. We saw it in Europe after Syria, and we will see it again if the migrant crisis blows up out of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So, there's so many reasons to just
give them their
just
money.
press the button.
Press
the button and let them have their money.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. So, what do you expect out of Congress when they're
Good question. Good question. We'll see. Maybe you get 100 people out of the 435 who are willing to oppose that policy. Hopefully it's a lot higher. Maybe all the Republicans, for partisan reasons, vote against Biden on this.
That'd be nice.
There you go. Let's do that.
Partisanship.
Yes.
What's wrong with it?
Anyway, we will have more Rising right after this.